All right, here we go. We have got to first off start with the sun. The sun is the very beginning of the energy that moves through the ecosystem. And I know that we all remember that. The sun is what gives the energy to the producers. The producers use the sun to make their own energy. Moving into food chains and food pyramids, we know that the sun is going to give energy to the producers. The producers are going to give energy to this guy here. Typically we call them herbivores, but now we're going to call them primary consumers. Primary consumers and herbivores are the same thing. They're the first person to eat in a food chain or a food pyramid, and they eat plants. So they are herbivores. Moving along the food chain, and you'll see here in a minute, up the food pyramid, we have our secondary consumers. They are going to eat the primary consumers and get their energy from the primary consumers. So this bird eats this cricket or grasshopper and gets his energy from that. So you have this secondary consumer. So primary consumer, secondary consumer, and secondary is pretty easy to remember because it has the word second in it. Moving up, we have our first or primary consumer, first level consumer, second consumer or secondary consumer to our third, what they call that, tertiary consumer. And our tertiary consumer is going to eat our secondary consumer, who ate the primary consumer, who ate the producer. And it does move on up to a fourth level. They're going to call that in this slide the apex predator. That is also called the quaternary consumer, which we will see in just a few moments. The quaternary consumer is the fourth thing to eat. And of course, as any of these things poop or die, they are broken down by decomposers, and their energy and their nutrients are returned back to the soil for the producers to use. Now, we've looked at food chains before, and food chains were the path of energy of food from one organism to the next. And we saw food chains on the first test where it went from grass to grasshopper to blue jay to owl. And we also saw what would happen if we messed with something in the food chain, this food chain in particular. If the snake population were to decrease and go down, that means the caterpillars would go up, which means more leaves would get eaten, and that would affect the trees negatively. So we've talked about food chains before. And again, when we're looking at food chains, the most important thing that we do with the food chains is thinking about these types of questions. What would happen if the bird population increased? So the birds go up. Well, if there's more birds, they would eat more grasshoppers, which means there would be less grasshoppers and there would be more plants growing in that ecosystem. And this one, we said, what if a drought hit the ecosystem? And we learned that drought means little to no water in an area. So the first thing affected by that is plants, because we know that water, the abiotic factor of water, affects plants. And then that would affect the consumers, from the first level consumer to the second level consumer to the third level consumer to the quaternary consumer. Food webs are when food chains overlap. It's not always, grass to rabbit to fox. When we look at this, there are other things that eat the grass in this ecosystem. We have the short-haired vole that's eating some grass, and he's also eating some blackberries, which are also eaten by the mouse. And so we can see that these food chains overlap. The food energy pyramid is something that's a little new, but it's very similar to the food chain. We notice down here at the bottom the largest portion of the food pyramid, and if we look at our ecosystems, the largest biotic factor in all food pyramids are plants. So the bottom of our food pyramid is plants, producers. They give their energy to the primary consumers, the first level consumers, the herbivores. These herbivores are then eaten by secondary consumers. And on some food pyramids, we stop at the third level or the tertiary consumer. And we'll see that that can actually go up one more level in just a moment. For example, in this one, again, this is always going to be producers at the bottom because they are the largest biotic factor in an ecosystem. That has moved up to my first level consumer or primary consumer. and this grasshopper is eaten by a secondary consumer, so it's the second thing to eat. Secondary consumer, the frog. The third level is a little tough. It's called tertiary, but it does start with a T, so that helps me remember that. And that is my third level consumer. And my fourth level is called quaternary. And I know that if we were counting as far as like number of things to eat, uno, dos, tres, quattro, so the quaternary consumer is here at the very top. And those show up in different types of questions on the test. So again, we've talked about here, highlighted, the tertiary consumer is going to be first level, second level, third level. And we've also talked about the quaternary consumer, which is this very, very top level. And those are your apex predators, things that really aren't hunted, and there's not really anything out there that's going to kill them. They just end up kind of dying off of old age, or they die of natural causes, and then decomposers break them down and return their nutrients back to the soil. Oftentimes, we have to look at what are the things that are changing the populations in an ecosystem. What's controlling the growth and the survival of a population? What makes the population of plants or animals go up or go down? And these things are called limiting factors. They are anything that controls the growth or survival of a population. Now, we've seen this because we did this in the window. We had water, temperature, soil, and sunlight. And we know that those abiotic factors definitely control the growth and survival of our plants. There are also biotic factors in an ecosystem that control the growth and survival of populations. If you take competition, if there are more animals competing over the same food source, that's going to change the growth and survival of those populations. If there are a lot more predators in an area, you would have less prey. And then there's parasitism, which we've talked about, and disease can also affect how things grow and survive, and those are limiting factors. Due to limiting factors and outside influences, sometimes populations get to a point where we start to worry about them a little bit. And when a population gets low enough, the first level that we're going to rate them at is threatened, and that is a species that is in danger of becoming endangered. That just means they're in trouble. We need to start watching out for those numbers of those animals and those populations, and the snow leopard is an example of that. And we want to make sure that we keep an eye on that and try to find out what may be causing that reduction in the numbers of snow leopards. If things were to get a little worse, in that case, we would move to endangered. Now, this species, the Amur leopard, is actually, their numbers are getting so low that they may go extinct. Now we really need to watch out what's going on. We need to put them in protected status and try to figure out ways to increase their population. Otherwise, we're going to move to the next level, and extinct means that there's none of them left. And again, extinct, like a species that has completely died out. We don't have any more of them left. And that is something that happens often. I mean, look at this. It wasn't that long ago that the western black rhino was declared extinct. And that's something that we've looked at, and we need to figure out, back with these other two, what are we going to do when a species is endangered? What are we going to do when a species is threatened to make sure that we don't have any species going extinct?